Evolutionary Hardcore episode 208 is coming your way. Today we're going to talk about tapering and pyramiding steroids on a cycle by Para Pharma. So on this one, we're going to go over what does tapering and pyramiding mean? Do they have benefits? Understanding esters. We're also going to talk about cycle examples using Para Pharma, and we're going to talk about why Para Pharma is the first choice of so many out there. First, let me remind everyone we are on Apple, we are on Spotify. Make sure you're liking, make sure you're subscribing, make sure you leaving comments. Tell your friends and family. We want to grow this podcast the right way, the organic way. We don't buy followers, we don't buy likes, we don't buy hits, we don't do the stuff that these other guys do. We want to do it the right way, and we want to grow this podcast through knowledge in the science to help you get the most out of your body. Everybody out there has a capability of doing something when it comes to this game. So we want to get everything out of you, at least 90%, milk 90% out of every single one of you. So help us out so the algorithms can pick us up and we can grow this podcast and make it really, really big. So let's start, Mobster. What does tapering and pyramiding mean? This is a very important topic.
Yeah.
When it comes to using steroids, a lot of people have different strategies that they want to implement. A lot of people want to reinvent the wheel. A lot of people think that certain things work for them. It could be a placebo effect. What are your thoughts on what does tapering and pyramiding even mean in the first place?
Right. So I'll use a very, very simple example here, Steve. And I'll also discuss the history. As I said, I went to Steve in the pre-show with the pyramiding idea, but I'll get to that aspect in a minute. So, in very simple terms, if we take the classic 500 milligrams of a short to medium acting or long acting testosterone, let's say 500 milligrams of testosterone in rate by way of example, the idea is that you could pyramid up. So start with 200 or 300 milligrams a week, work your way up after 2 or 3 weeks to 500 milligrams, stay on there for a few weeks, and then taper or pyramid down. But the phrases are kind of interchangeable, but typically I would argue that pyramiding is, in this context, going upwards of it from a low dose to a high dose, and tapering would be going from a higher dose back down to a lower dose. So you wouldn't taper at the beginning, you would pyramid, you would taper at the end of a cycle, and you would pyramid up. Now, in terms of the history, so here's where some of the concept came from, and Steve's quite correct. Well, people will try to sometimes take, for want of a better phrase, a unique approach. And I got to say, Steve, very little is new when it comes to these things. Very, very little, to say the least, is new. And the other argument, also in terms of the unique approach, is that somehow their physiology, the way that they respond to steroids, is so much different from anybody else's. Arguably, sometimes it's just that they want better results from what they're doing, and they're trying a different approach to get a better result. But again, if there's millions of users out there, and we're talking about steroid uses pretty much predominantly from the 1960s till now, that means we've been using steroids, anabolic steroids, for performance enhancement for 65 fucking years, as we do this show in 2025. And I would say, Steve, being there, seen there, and done it really, really applies here. Back in the day, and I was a massive follower, and he's still a buddy of mine. I haven't spoken to him for a while, of Mick Hart, aka the layman's guide guru. And one of the things that Mick promoted a lot of, and we know that this is pointless now, and I was a huge fan of this for ages and ages, was this idea of tapering off at the end of the cycle. So let's say again, I'm on 500 milligrams. At the end of the cycle, this is the reason why Mick said it. You would go from 500 in the latter weeks to 300 to 200, with the idea of easing into your PCT, giving your body a chance to recover, and basically allowing a quicker, if you will, reboot of your natural testosterone levels. The problem with that argument, which was actually argued at the time, and I disagreed at the time, but now I completely see the point that was being made. If there's still steroids in your system of anything above baseline level, what your body would produce, and all things being considered, the knowledge that you and I would argue about, Steve, in terms of quote unquote restarting your natural testosterone, would apply here. What is the fucking point of tapering off? It makes no sense in that particular regards. It might make sense, as we will argue in the rest of the show, for other reasons. But specifically here, it made no sense with rebooting your natural testosterone levels. The esters would need to clear your system, and you would need to encourage your system to reboot, so to speak, or restart from whatever level it was suppressed down to for you to get back natural levels. So in that context, the suggestion historically, and I'm talking about 20, 30 years ago, makes no sense whatsoever. It makes sense, as I say, in other particular regards. So, yeah, that's my kind of best basic explanation for tapering and pyramiding. What do you think on that before we move on?
When it comes to pyramiding up, it's the opposite effect of front loading. And we see front loading as a strategy. We talked about front loading previously, front loading or kickstarting a cycle. So with kickstarting, you would basically, the definition could be different things, but my definition would be with kickstarting is you're adding a short ester or you're adding an oral to start the cycle for the first 4 weeks, along with a longer ester that's going to take longer to reach peak levels in your system. So if you're doing a 12-week cycle, you would kickstart with an oral cycle. If you're doing a bulking cycle, for example, you'd use Dianabol to kickstart the cycle. Front loading would be the opposite of pyramiding because with front loading, you're doing a bigger amount. Let's say you're running equipoise for 12 weeks or 14 weeks. You'd start out with 800 milligrams to front load of the equipoise. This way, more hits your system quicker in theory. So pyramiding would be the opposite of that. Pyramiding would be, as Mobster said, you start 200 milligrams, then go to 400 milligrams, then go to 600 milligrams and ease it up. Now, what would be the purpose of doing that? Does the strategy have benefits? Which we're gonna, get into
Yeah,
it
yeah,
shortly, and we'll talk
yes,
about that in a second. But that would be what tapering and pyramiding means. I think that makes a lot of sense. At the end of the day, I've seen different definitions. I've seen these words in different contexts. I've
yes.
seen different things mean different things. Like I'll give you an example: shutdown. I've seen people use shutdown. They'll come on the forum and say, "I'm shut down. Please help me." I'm like, "What do you mean by you're shut down?" Because being
Mm,
shut down to them means I have no libido. I can't get an erection. But in reality, that's not what shutdown means. Shutdown actually means that your HPTA, your pituitary glands aren't functioning. So we see these words get thrown out, and
yes,
depending on the context, it can mean different things. But it's weird because, like in the gym, you see people. I try to avoid talking to people in the gym because of this reason, because they use these words, in when it comes to nutrition or weight training or
yeah,
steroid use or
yeah, yeah.
whatever, and they use these words way out of context, and
Exactly,
they
Steve.
confuse themselves.
It can make you sound like you know what you're talking about when you don't. But as you said, I think the argument here is very much context. And you need almost to get them to say, what do you mean when you say that? Oh, okay, now I understand what you mean, because my definition might differ. And again, pyramid in training works perfectly fine. Pyramid in steroids, not necessarily. And again, even if we agreed with what they were saying, they'll say, well, what are you using? Okay, so everything you're using is a long acting ester. It means it's going to be in your system 20 days, 14 days, 7 days, and so on and so forth. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, you're going to change your cycle to what? Okay, so then we need to understand what. And so therefore, you can't just throw these words out there without understanding what you're doing, what's in your system, the half life of the steroid, and so on and so forth. Or literally even the clearance time of the steroid, if we're talking about, as I said, the idea of restarting natural levels. And even like Steve said, if, for example, you know, suppression is a much better argument than saying, oh, well, I've crushed my HEPs or I need to restart my HEPs, because you go, without a blood test, have you? Are you just at lower levels than would naturally occur, and therefore you're still producing some, or you're producing none? I would argue that it would be very unlikely for the majority of users to be producing zero testosterone. I can't see that. Equally, the idea that they're producing less than normal and that their body's not quite peaked in terms of its health or response, etc., etc. Yeah, absolutely. But we don't know that, nor do they. And they might literally be only showing one or two signs. So in that example, in that context, it needs to be clearly explained what you mean. Look, An obvious example here was, Steve, if you and I went to see our MD, our GP, as we say here in the UK, family doctor, and had this kind of conversations, he might know what you mean because he's met you before. But for the most part, you'd probably have to explain. No good saying, I have an ache. Where's the ache? Or what are you doing? Someone talked about their father on the forums this morning. Perhaps I should give him BPC TB500 for his aching knee. And I said, is he obese? Because a lot of people who've got dodgy knees, if they haven't got it in sport, are they fat? Aching joints when you're fat makes it. So you must understand the context of the conversation and the way that the term's being used. Because as Steve said, they can be thrown around and it's too easy. And again, it might make sense in a sort of skewed logic kind of way, but it needs to make sense medically speaking. It needs to make sense in regards to what you're actually doing. For example, again, if all things were equal, but you changed your diet, or if all things were equal, but you changed your training, if all things were equal, but you changed your workload, again, this would have an effect on your results. So it makes sense. I would argue that for the most part, all things being equal, what we're looking for here is, as always, better results from what we're doing. And it's nice to have these ideas and suggestions come up, but they need to make sense. And I don't just mean chemically in terms of the structure of the steroid, the half-life of the steroid, whatever else. It needs to make sense in either the results that you get or your ability to recover after a cycle. That's pretty much it. And again, let me give you a sort of wave where you might want to manipulate the variables. In other words, change the amount that you're doing up or down. Results. Again, and I've mentioned this many times on many shows when I talk about competitive bodybuilders. But let's just take Joe and say that Joe wants to get leaning into shape. And Steve said, bulking would be another example. Let's go leaning into shape. If Joe has an idea in his mind of how his chest is going to look, or his abs are going to look, and so on and so forth, Joe starts a cycle with the legendary, the standard 500 milligrams a week of some sort of testosterone, and manipulates his diet and increases his cardio. Over time, I would hope, through a cycle, let's say 8 to 12 weeks, Steve, 3 to 4 weeks in, he should start to see progress, even if he's using a longer acting ester. He might start to see the outline of his abs. If in Joe's mind, he had a really, really good idea how those abs are going to look. So as the cycle progresses, Joe's abs start to pop more and more as the diet gets tighter and his meal prep increases, and he's getting more and more daily steps in and doing more work on the stair climb and whatever else. He might approach some point where he's almost where he wants to be in terms of his abs, but he might still need to work on his chest and his shoulders just for another week or two. It might make sense at that particular point in Joe's mind to ease back, to taper off from the 500 milligrams down to 400, down to 300, while still maintaining the body fat levels around his abdominal area, but at the same time, still using the slightly longer esters in his system, even though he's tapered down a little bit, to assist him past that point in where he wants his shoulder development to be while his abs are popping. See, that makes sense. And that's exactly how a competitive bodybuilder would think, because you're going to manipulate the variables as you approach competition day by using, as the competitive bodybuilder does, shorter esters. So we must, I think the number one thing here, Steve, when it comes to tapering and pyramiding, might be arguably, and I've said this before, this also applies to back in the day, choosing the right ester. Because again, what have I said on other shows about people
Yeah, and
sometimes,
let's talk about esters on
yeah,
the
it's
next
not even
segment.
that, Steve. Sometimes it's about what's available to them. And we'll talk about esters in a minute. But it's more sometimes what people say, oh, this is what I want to run. And this is where we might come in on the forum and say, hang on, why don't you do this for now, but do that for later on? You guys can get hold of pretty much any ester version of the steroid that they want. Because back in the day, that wasn't the case. We literally took what was available versus now when almost anything is available. So yeah, let's talk about other things as
So, do these steroids have benefits? Monster talked a little bit about what people think. It could be, as he said, a lot of it can be a placebo effect. A lot of it can be like different things. But a lot of times, people will make the argument that they want to see how they react to the gear first then gradually increase it. So in that context, it has some merit when it comes to pyramiding because
Absolutely, yes.
yeah, because let's say you're using trenbolone. Let's say you get Para Pharma Tren is your first time using it, and you get the ACE, which is a short ester. We're going to talk about examples, cycle ideas later, and this is going to be a perfect example of that. But I just want to kind of give you, you know, an idea of what someone could be thinking. They're thinking in their mind, I've read all these horror stories about Tren. I read about how people they get on Tren, they turn into a different person. They get roid rage. They end up in jail. They get in fights with their wife or girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever. And at the end of the day, there is legitimacy to that. So it's like they say, well, I want to kind of ease into it. I want to see how I do. Let me go on it for 2 or 3 weeks at a lower dose. Let me do maybe 100 or 150 milligrams a week, which is below normal dose for a male and see
Yeah.
how I do. Do I start getting these issues, this aggression, this roid rage? I'm worried about that. I've had a history. I have a record. I don't want to get in trouble again. I don't want my wife to get freaked out and call the cops on me. I've had a history of domestic violence in my past, and I wanted to get past that. So in that situation, it makes sense. I'm going to start at 150 milligrams instead of starting at 300 or 400 milligrams. And then I'm going to see how I do. And after a couple weeks, I'll raise it by 50. After a couple weeks, I'll raise it by another 50. And then I'll go from there. So in that respect, it can make sense. Also, some of these peptides, like these GLP-1s, Mobster and I were talking about GLP-1s on the pre-show because he got involved with someone on a thread about talking about retatrutide and tirzepatide, and it makes sense on those because the side effects, if you jump into them at too high of a dose the first month, you can
Yes.
end up being very sick and nauseous, and
Yes.
your appetite will get absolutely crushed where you can't eat anything, and that may not work in your favor. Feeling nauseous all the time, how are you going to go work out? How are you going to go to work and make a living if you're nauseous all the time? That
What
won't
about,
work.
for example, Stephen, we've discussed some of the side effects, good and bad, of other steroids. When we talk about, I believe, Winstrol, we said about how it can dry out your joints. And we talked to other people will sometimes have certain steroids that seem to aggravate their acne, their skin condition and oiliness of the skin. So it makes absolute sense. I would argue, Steve, ignoring trend for a second, any steroid, and especially if you're new, one, to using PEDs at all, but two, especially if you've never used a singular steroid, for example, it's quite mild, but in reality, I've never used at any point for any cycle to date Tylenol. Never. I doubt very much that I would have any particular issues with it, but it would make sense with certain injectable steroids for sure, dosage wise. And here's another example. Just literally, if I could take certain steroids, which I have taken, and I've moderated my dosages for years, but suddenly decide for some reason that I've decided I want to run the same steroid I've run before, but at a much higher dose to get a response, it would make sense absolutely with a new steroid that I've never used or a steroid that I have used for a higher dose to start with the lower dose and then work my way up. As Steve said, if I've not used a steroid at all, any steroid, mild or otherwise, why would I jump in at the deep end? Because I might get absolutely great results with a lower dose. Why would I jump in at the deep end, for example, as Steve said, with Tren or with Halo or with Winstrol, like I've just pointed out, and not get used to the side effects, not get used to how I respond? And an obvious example here, which has been used before, and I think we've used this analogy has been used many times before, and it doesn't matter whether it's steroids or indeed any kind of drug, Steve. If it's in your fucking system, and I'm thinking it's just a painkillers and over-the-counter drugs and prescribed medications, and you've gone in hard, so to speak, at a much higher dose than necessary, how are you going to get that shit out? You can't. So, for example, certain painkillers can rip the fuck out of your stomach at higher dosages. And some prescribed medication, I've been prescribed painkillers in the past, which required me to have another medication just to stop the damage to my gut because of the painkiller they were giving me. So there would be no good me going in, for example, at 800 milligrams when I've got great results in terms of pain relief at 200 milligrams. I can't take those 600 extra milligrams that I don't need out of my system. I've literally got to wait for them to clear now. So it absolutely makes sense in that particular way. Either flexing if you like, or varying the amount that you're taking from a lower dose to a higher dose, just to see how you respond, rather than going, for example, as I've already said, 500 milligrams, and the very next cycle straight into 1500. No need. Why don't I go 750 or 1000? That makes sense. And
Yeah.
I could do
On
that
the
during a
Winstrol, it's
cycle.
also the hair. If you're worried
Yeah,
about your hair
that's a
loss and
classic.
you
Exactly.
jump in
Yes.
there at 100 milligrams a day, and then you end up you take a shower a week later and you look at your hand. This has happened to
Mm.
me, and you see hair all over your hand when you're
Yep.
shampooing your hair. Like, what the fuck is going on here? Well,
Decadic would be another one, Steve,
yeah,
where people haven't got the ratios right, so they're struggling with Decadic.
yeah.
Obvious. Again, water retention might be another
So we're
one.
going to talk about more about, how to cycle and pyramid on one of in the next two segments. But first, Mobster, touch a little bit more about the strategies where we talk about pyramiding, talk about tapering. Is there a context where tapering actually has a benefit, or is that just in people's minds? So let me start with that, and I'll let you
Yeah,
kind of think about that a little
yeah.
bit. You mentioned earlier about the Mick Hart thing. And you're absolutely right. Here's the thing, when you have exogenous hormones in your system, okay, whether you're taking 1,000 milligrams of testosterone, then you reduce it to 500 milligrams, then you reduce it to 200 milligrams, then you reduce it to 100 milligrams, then you reduce it to 50 milligrams, it's not going to matter. As long as you're taking exogenous hormones, your body's still going to get shut down. It doesn't matter if you run 2,000 milligrams or 5,000 milligrams or 100 milligrams. It doesn't matter. Someone who's on TRT, they're shut down. They're shut down forever. That's why when you go on TRT, you have to make that decision of, I'm going to be on TRT the rest of my life. Well, you're only running 100 or 150 milligrams a week of testosterone. Okay, you're shut down. It don't matter if it's 1,000 or if it's 2,000 or if it's 100. You're still shut down. Shut down is shut down. So reducing the dose going into your PCT is not going to make a difference. Now, when we get in our next segment, understanding esters, I'm going to explain more about that. But let me bring in Mobster to touch upon tapering. Are there really any benefits to tapering steroids that you can see, or is it just placebo?
I was going to say no, but that would make for a stupidly short show, Steve. I would argue that for the most part, again, as I said earlier, when with regards to the results, if the person's getting the results, that's the only thing that really should matter, apart from dealing with side effects. So look, let me give you an example. And I've actually physically done this when I thought the whole pyramid and tapering thing done, and it actually made a perverse kind of financial sense. And I might see this be used as an excuse if it's a question of how many steroids I've got and how much money I can afford to spend on steroids. So I said this. I would just argue that I was probably wrong, but I said this back in the day. I would pyramid up and I would taper down. And my initial steroid use, as many listeners will know, regular.
Let's move on to understanding esters and differences because I kind of touched on it on the last segment. So look, there's a big issue with people who argue that tapering has any merit. And a lot of times they don't understand how esters work. And with these anabolic steroids, with these injectables, they add these esters to these steroids for a reason. Okay? They add them to provide a slow release. So when you take an injectable anabolic steroid that has an ester attached to it, which is pretty much in 99.9% of cases, unless you're using test suspension, or you're using tren ester or any other steroid without an ester attached, it's going to go into your system and it's going to release slowly. It's just like when you go to the pharmacy and you see Mucinex on the shelf. You have a 24-hour Mucinex, a 48-hour Mucinex, a 72-hour Mucinex, and so on. Why is that? It's because the Mucinex, that's a 72-hour Mucinex, it's going to slow release in your system. But the 24-hour Mucinex is going to be in your system quicker because it releases quicker in your system. So you got to remember that when it comes to using it. So it's very important to understand how these esters works, or you're potentially losing gains, or you're keeping gains on the table. So when it comes to esters, it's not just starting when you're on steroids, it's also finishing. So when you are on anabolic steroids, depending on what you're using, let me use an example. If you're using nandrolone decanate, which is Deca durabolin, a lot of people know it as Deca. It's got a long ass ester. It's got a 15, 16 day half life. Okay, which means it's going to take 4 or 5 times that 14, that 15 days to be out of your system. So it's going to take 7, 8, 9 weeks to be out of your system. So if you taper down DECA, finishing a cycle, it's not going to get help you get it out of your system necessarily faster because it's still going to take 7, 8, 9 weeks. You see? So you're not going to speed up the process very much by tapering it down. So if you're running 400 milligrams and then you drop it to 300 milligrams, you drop it to 200 milligrams, and you drop it to 100 milligrams, it's still that 100 milligrams on your last injection is still going to be in your system 7, 8, 9 weeks, and it's still going to be shutting you down. So really, there's a very minimal benefit to tapering down. And that is one of the things where we have to understand esters. Now, if you want to be flexible and you want it to taper down, you could pull it off with an oral steroid. Something like Dianabol, for example, only has a 4 or 5 hour half life. So it's going to be out of your system in a few days once you stop taking it. Now, the estrogen, though, won't be out of your system in a few days. It's going to take longer for the estrogen to be out of your system. Estrogen is going to be, it isn't just like magic where you stop taking the Dianabol and the estrogen the next day. Oh, I went from having gyno issues and bloat and all these other water retention issues from excess estrogen. That's going to be out of my system overnight and it's going to be gone. No, it takes time. It could take you weeks to clear out that estrogen, the excess estrogen that you have. So, again, tapering down, there's very minimal benefits or minimal effects when it comes to tapering down, but it's going to be more when it comes to using oral steroids because they have a shorter half-life, and it's going to be much less using a longer ester steroid. So you've got to keep all that in mind when it comes to how you're planning both pyramiding
Yes.
and tapering
Yes.
because esters must be understood. Guys like your buddy or that you talked about earlier, Mick, I don't think he really understood how esters worked. I don't think he understood that. And we've seen some of these
Yeah.
guys too say that. And a big reason why is not because necessarily they're old school or old timers, but you got to remember in those days, you didn't have access to what we have access to today with
Yes.
the
Blood
websites,
testing or
the blood
testosterone
work.
levels being
Yeah.
measured. Yeah.
And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm full of shit, he's like, Steve, you don't know what you're talking about. Go get blood work done. Run a long ester steroid and go get blood work done. And run testosterone undecanate and run blood work. Stop using it, and then go run blood work after 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. You'll still see it in your system
Yep.
because it
Yep.
has a super long half life. So even if you pyramid it down, even if you taper it down, it's not going to make a difference to do it, and it could hurt you more than help you when you're pyramiding something like that with a long ester. It's just going to make it all that longer to build up in your system. So it's pointless to pyramid something like that. So really the only merit is
Here's
when it's
another
something
question.
short ester, I think.
Yeah, I would argue with the shorter esters. I've been rereading just recently, Steve, some of Paul Borison's work, and he actually, in one of the books I'm reading, reiterated something. And again, this was written a long time ago, probably 15, 20 years ago. He reiterated something that was quite common at the time. And we actually discussed the idea recently when we said about short or high intensity cycles. Part of the problem was that these guys were doing typically 4 or 5 weeks, but very, very high dosages. And then this is part of the idea versus the science, he had them coming off for 4 to 6 weeks and then back on. Now, we know metabolites of testosterone can be found in the B sample, never mind the A sample, with MMA fighters 2 fucking years later. So that's in terms of being found positive for using steroids, as Steve said, with the half lives. So, for example, he had been doing high dosages of multiple steroids, including 500 milligrams a day of sustanon. I go straight away, that makes no sense for 4 weeks, because as you just said, it will still be in your system. It's one of those ones that takes time to peak. It's one of those ones that's still going to be in systems quite a while afterwards, typically 2 to 3 weeks again, in terms of you still feeling the benefits of sustanon, and in a week and a half later, you were back up. So, you know what I mean? The idea behind these things, the theory behind these things, is fun to discuss as a sort of conceptual idea of how best we can create the best anabolic environment, etc. But the reality must be, and I mentioned this earlier on, PED choice, the steroid choice, and we have greater accessibility. And as Steve's just said and did in detail, understanding the esters that are in your system. If we're on a long ester and we know that it's going to be in a system just as a sort of basic, useful way, never mind the overall half-life of 2 weeks, and we sort of taper at the end of the cycle with the idea of somehow doing some benefit to ourselves beyond the restarting of the hepta. I'm not seeing it. I can understand perhaps the idea, and I said this earlier on in the show, Steve, of choosing products, choosing dosages, and finding that I don't need to run the product that high, so I could taper back down, or I'm very, very close to achieving the look that I'm looking for. But again, it would be easier to start with a longer acting ester and have the same steroid, but with a shorter esterized version towards the end of the cycle and having much, much more ability to have the product in and out of my system quicker as I achieve the look that I'm after. And again, for the great and vast majority of listeners, you're not really looking at a competition date. You're not looking at a modeling gig. You might argue that you've got a particular holiday coming up. It has to happen by a certain time. That's probably the case. But the vast majority of people that are using steroids, there is no specific date that applies. Therefore, it's literally either if you're looking for a look, or you're looking for peak strength, or you're looking for peak muscle size, this can happen in a normal way at the end of a cycle. I would argue that beyond that, Steve, as we've discussed before, we will talk about cycles now. The placebo effect, is probably the be all and end all. And again, there's always, and we've touched on this in other shows, how we feel on testosterone, how it affects us when we're on TRT, going from negligible amounts of testosterone naturally produced to a TRT level, how we feel on a cycle versus TRT or no gear at all. That's all about the sensation. It's not about the results. It's not about strength or muscle size. It's just how we feel when we're on high T levels versus low T levels. And so the placebo is very much a thing of how you feel. There's even an argument to be made, and we're all guilty of this. I'm no different, even though I train for strength and Steve would train for something else, in terms of how we perceive ourselves and how we think we look. And we've talked about this, people thinking how they look their best in the morning, where they're dry, they haven't had breakfast, they haven't had tea, they haven't had a cup of coffee, they're slightly dehydrated, and they look in the mirror in the bathroom as they're cleaning their teeth. Oh my God, my abs look amazing. And as we go through the day with work, with stress, or whatever else, and with other food that we're eating, we change very little, but we can change sometimes in how we perceive how we look through the day. This is also why we recommend for coaches and talk about this for prep coaching for competition, having a second set of eyes who doesn't necessarily change how they see you through the day and how you're going to be perceived. Because again, that placebo thing of our own perception will change by the hour, Steve, from hungry to not hungry, from thirsty to not thirsty, and from literally stress levels. We know that even in the case of top professional bodybuilders, again, and this is another argument for these kind of things, some top pros have argued that having a competition later in the day has affected their look. But that's as much about water manipulation and diuretics as it is about steroids. So again, unless you're prepping, competing, etc., for a specific date and time, in the case of the top pros, evening versus fucking 11:30, which was last year at the Olympia, I can't see that too much is going to change. And that's in a day, Steve, never mind in the case of ending our cycle 8, 10, 12, 16 weeks or whatever else. Let's have a little look here at the options and availability in how we would
So let
run
me
longer
uh,
restes,
let me
shorter
give you an
restes.
idea. I touched upon the Dianabol idea earlier. Let me explain how you would pyramid and taper using Dianabol and test prop. And really, the only way you could pull this off with testosterone is to use a short ester testosterone. So I'll use testosterone propionate. It's a short ester. So you could go with the Para Pharma Dianabol, Para Pharma test probe. And the good thing about the Para Pharma test probe, Mobster, as you know, is that the test probe is very smooth. So you're getting a high quality, smooth process where it's not painful like other brands. So in this example, you could do Dianabol at 20 milligrams for 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks, then increase it to 30 milligrams for 2 more weeks. While you're also using test probe at 50 milligrams every other day, then increasing it at 50 milligrams every day after 4 weeks. Then maybe increasing it to 100 milligrams every day by week 8, then stopping it. On the flip side, you can do the opposite way. You could, if you wanted to taper it down. So in this example of tapering it down, you can run Test Pro for 6 weeks at 100 milligrams a day, which comes out to 700 milligrams a week. That's a big dose. So you can adjust that. You can go even 80 milligrams. And then you can drop the dose down to 50 milligrams every day for 2 additional weeks. Then 50 milligrams every other day for the last 2 weeks. So you're tapering it down slowly. And then while using Dianabol in a similar fashion and running it at 30 milligrams for 4 weeks, and then
Yeah.
10 milligrams for the last 10 weeks. So you're going from 30 down to 10, and then after 2 weeks you stop, and then that would be the tapering way to do it. So that would be a good option for that. Anything, Mobster, you want to add to that?
I
And I'll
just
talk about a cutting recomp stack.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Para Pharma options here, Steve. And as Steve said, they have a Testo P, testopropionate, 100 milligrams a milliliter that Steve could suggest you using. And they have an oral Dianabol 20 milligram option that you could use in those examples. So, yeah, give us some other examples, Steve. And we can also talk about where I might want a lower dosage. I'll throw one in here now. We did a recent show on the nicer steroids, the ones that make you feel good versus the ones that do not. I'm looking here at their Superdrol 10 option, Steve. And again, that might be one where lowering the dose would negate some of the harsher side effects. But talk about a cutting option, as you said, and I'll tell the listeners what's available.
So you can do with Para Pharma their Tren Ace. I talked about Tren Ace earlier. You could start at 25 milligrams every day for 4 weeks. This would be a great option for anyone out there who's worried about trend side effects. So start at this 25 milligrams every day for 4 weeks of the Tren Ace, then increase it to 50 milligrams every day for 2 more weeks, and then do 75 milligrams every day for 2 additional weeks. So that's an 8 week cycle. You're starting out at 25 milligrams, the first half of it. Then for 2 weeks, you do 50 milligrams. Then for the last 2 weeks, you do 75 milligrams. That's wonderful. Then you can add Parapharma Anavar or Parapharma Winstrol in there. And you can pyramid it up and start at a low dose with the trend. You could start at 20 milligrams or 30 milligrams and then increase it to 40 or 50 milligrams and see how you do. If you start getting issues, if you start getting side effects, you can always drop the dose back down. So that would be a great way to pyramid. And then tapering would be a similar fashion, except with the tapering, you start at a higher dose and then you drop it down. So if you're going to 8 weeks or 10 weeks, you could do the first 5 weeks at a higher dose. Then for 2, 3 weeks, cut the doses in half, and then the last 2, 3 weeks, cut the doses in half again. That would be a good tapering option that you could do on that. Mobster?
Again, looking at the Parapharma options here, Steve, they have a Tren Ace, which is Trenbo A100. And they have two options for the oral Anavar in Anavar 10 milligrams and Anavar 50 milligrams. And in fact, you could probably buy this example, Steve, both the two types of Anavar, because it's probably easier to manipulate down or up with the Anavar 10s, but you'd have to take more pills. But obviously, start the higher dose and then taper off from 50 milligram pills to 10 milligram pills, multiples thereof, of course, 40, 30, 20, 10, etc. And the same thing if you was pyramiding up again. And again, this would literally come down to just how long you decided to pyramid up and taper down. So, for example, Steve, if it was an 8 week cycle, you might spend the first 7 to 10 days pyramiding up using the 10 milligram options with the VAR, for example, 5 or 6 weeks at the higher dose, and then taper off at the end again, switching from the 50 milligram back to the 10s to enable you to taper off. That would just be a much easier way than splitting pills or whatever in that example. In relation to the Trenbo A100, the trenbolone acetate, it would be simply a case of the half a mil, 3/4 of a mil, and so on and so forth, depending upon the dosages you're taking. And that can sometimes be a little bit, and it depends on what you're taking, guys, and especially if you're taking combinations. There's a little bit where we get asked this sometimes, especially with peptides, Steve. The guys will ask, am I putting the right amount in? Because they get confused by the whole IUs and CCs and milliliters and so on and so forth. It's very easy with the milligram type products. It's not so easy sometimes to sort of calculate. And it also depends on the size of the syringe and all the rest of it. So that's where it can feel a little bit complicated. And as we even said earlier in the show, it's far sort of more complicated when it comes to peptides and the GLPs and products like Clen than it is steroids. Steroids is almost a much, much simpler approach. Have you got any other ones there, Steve? For example, strength stacker or or bulk or whatever.
Yeah, I'll let you talk strength stack, but let me go over a longer ester. Let's say you want to try this with longer esters. You want to experiment with it. You want to see, how what happens. You need to see it for yourself, and that's okay. So if you're going to do longer esters, let's say you want to do equipoise or deca, which both have longer esters. How would you do it? How would you pyramid those up? So I think it makes sense in that situation. You could start out at 200 milligrams of either. And Para Pharma does have both available. And then you could, after about 3 weeks, you can increase it to 400 milligrams. Then after another 3 weeks, you can increase it to 600 milligrams. Then after another 3 weeks, you can increase it to 800 milligrams, and so on. And then on the flip side, you can do it the other way. There was a guy on the EF forum back in the day. He always insisted on front loading. He'd always front load and then taper down because he was so impatient and he wanted instant results and he wanted instant gratification. So he would start with these steroids at like really high dosages, like 1,000 milligrams. And then after like 4 weeks, he'd drop it down to 500 milligrams. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, he'd drop it in half to like 200 or 300 milligrams. So he'd do it that way. And he insisted that it worked better for him because he didn't want to wait longer for these steroids to build up in the system. He wanted to have more hit quicker by doing a really absurdly high dose the first 3, 4 weeks. So he would do it like that. And he didn't want to kickstart. He didn't like using orals. So I'm not sure what happened to that guy, Mobster. Last I heard, he lived like in some place up in like Detroit or something. But
I was going to say
I'm trying to
become a
remember his
human
name. I think his name
yo-yo.
was like Hayes or something. I don't know if you remember. His name was
You become
Hayes.
a human yo-yo, Steve. Big,
Yeah,
small,
he was
big, small.
crazy. He was one of those guys that, like, in school, he was the guy who used to love to blow up like the chemistry lab, you know? That's the guy and mess around when it comes to that stuff. So yeah, at the end of the day, like there's different strategies, and he swore by this strategy. And look, it worked for him. A lot of this is mental. A lot of this is mental. A lot of weight training is mental. Everything
Oh,
in life
absolutely,
is
Steve.
mental.
Our desire to be big or strong
Yeah.
or muscular or lean is all
Yeah.
mental.
You,
And then
you,
obviously
yeah.
how,
He
how
wants
much you
to.
want it and how quickly you want it.
But he wants to take something to enjoy. It's just like when you go buy a fruit tree. Okay, do you want to buy the little baby fruit tree that's going to take 5 years before it makes fruit? Or do you want to
Yeah.
buy the
You want
fruit
one with
tree that's
fruit already on it.
already
Yeah,
one or two
yeah,
years old that you just literally
yeah.
have to plant and it'll be making fruit for you like literally in the next season? So
I,
it's just,
I would argue in his circumstances, I think it would be less his desire to get bigger quicker and more the desire, which would make sense, to retain the fucking size that you've grown so quickly. And that's the difficulty. And that's probably where some of these ideas come from as well. Even with the suggestions of the cycles I was talking about earlier on, I'm just looking at some of the decanate options here, Steve, at EQ. They've got a bold around 500 milligram, and they've actually got four Deca options. They've got a Deca test, which is Decanate 200 milligrams and a test in Namphate 200 milligrams. They've got a Decan 300. They've got a Decan P, which is the NPP product, which is 100. It's called the Decan P 150. And they've also got a Decanate 500 milligrams. In that situation, and if we were just talking about Decanate and we've discussed different options for the esters. You've got the option of the Decanate P, the NPP, as we would call it, which is the quicker acting, therefore the shorter esterized version, which is one way you could get quicker in or use it at the end of a cycle, and have the longer Decanate 300 or the longer Decanate 500. My actual preference in this example, Steve, would probably be for the 500. One, because I'm going to mix it, in my case, for bulking, with sustanon. So I'm going to use it in the same thing. It's just how much I want, and therefore it probably be half a mil or 3/4 of a mil. I can't see that there's going to be any issues with post-injection pain, even at 500 milligrams here. And again, because I'm mixing it with a sustanon, regards running it solo. So again, I do like that Para Pharma has these different options available for you. And arguably, with the different options, you've got the different dosages and the ability to use long-acting ester versions and shorter-acting ester versions of what is more or less the same steroid each and every time. Same with the Trenbolone, same with lots of the other medications, especially the testosterones. You've got the options of running shorter esters and longer esters in the same cycle. Something else, Steve, on this particular topic overall, that you and I have discussed on previous shows, I was very gung ho and fixed. This is a cycle I'm going to run. This is my plan. I can't see any need to vary it. And then Steve and I did a show where Steve said, "But what if you became ill? What if something came up? What if work changed? What if literally? What if you don't respond well to the steroid? What if you respond very badly to the steroid? Why the fuck would you stick to something that you're not getting on well with, not getting a response from, and so on and so forth?" Steve also pointed out, not necessarily in that show, but I think he touched on it very briefly, actually in the pre-show to me. He said that some of the stuff that we used to use back in the day wasn't what it was supposed to be. And the idea that you should stick to something that's not working because it's fake and you're not getting a response and not change it to something else, at which point you've already wasted 2 weeks, for example, it absolutely makes sense to vary what you're doing and change the dosages and so on and so forth just to make up for the fucking time you've lost, Steve. So, again, the availability of products, the companies like Para Pharma giving you different options, and obviously companies like Para Pharma, again, producing solid products, enables you to be as flexible as you want to. But don't be flexible. I'm pretty much going to say this, Steve. Don't be flexible just fucking because, like you were talking about with that fairly early on, it did seem very much a case of, in some examples, people have kind of come at this from I'll use the phrase pseudo-scientific kind of argument. It's very hard to make that argument because the science doesn't really have it, because we literally haven't had studies that have covered these things in the way that we want them to. So we then have to rely on information that's been gathered from our own experience and experience of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of users over very long periods of time. Like I said, 60-something years. You don't need to vary things just because. You should kind of have a reason for doing it and an approach to do it that makes sense. And the bottom line has to be with these kind of cycles and stacks, Steve, that you are getting the results that you want. Let me look at some other Para Pharma products here, Steve, just to give you some guys an example. I'm looking at the testosterones. An extra, and name for 8 years, Steve, 250. What else have we got here? We've got Cut Stack, which is, of course, a combination of products, different primos. What else am I looking at again? There's 2 different primos that I'm looking at here. Another testosterone option, testosterone, Testo C 250. Just as an example again, and we have seen this kind of weirdly suggested, and I think it more applies to the idea of quote unquote cruising or quote unquote sports TRT. The idea of, I think someone posted the other day about adding something to their TRT. Oh, you mean a cycle? And then when you looked at their TRT, it was 300, 400 milligrams. Oh, then you mean a cruise, and so on and so forth. So yeah, let me look what else. Let me just go for all the options here, Steve. And I'm actually thinking, although it's a steroid-focused podcast that we're doing, one of the ones we would absolutely have you taper up and pyramid down on would be clenbuterol, for example. When we've discussed this in a previous show, Steve, we
Yeah.
talked about.
Yeah. So let me explain that. Let me
Yeah,
explain
yeah,
why that necessary. So in clen,
yes,
if you jump into clen at too high of a dose, you can cause heart damage. You can cause an inflamed heart. So clenbuterol is not a steroid; it is a drug. And the way clenbuterol works is it will basically fire up, different things in your body to make your heart rate go up and enlarge your heart and boost, increase your metabolism and stuff like that. It's the same thing with thyroid medication, the T3, the T4. So it's a good idea on those to definitely start low and work your way up to gauge what they're doing in your body. But on the clenbuterol, if you jump right into 120 or 140 micrograms right off the bat, you can end up like with problems like shaky hands and not being able to sleep and heartburn, all kinds of problems. So you want to start like at 20 or 40 micrograms and gradually work your way up. And then once you get to a number that's causing side effects that you can't handle, then you can drop it back down 20, 30, 40 micrograms and then kind of cruise on that dose. So you have to kind of find the dose that works for you in that situation. But it's harder with steroids because steroids, they take a longer time to kick in your system and peak in your system. There's a slower release. So it's going to be a lot harder because they're hormones with esters attached. They're not drugs like clenbuterol, which have very short half-lives, you see. So it's really about trial and error in a lot of these situations. Go ahead, Mobster. Yep.
Yeah, any of the harsh look for the most part. Again, I've referred to us doing the nice steroid versus a nasty steroid. I would probably suggest that the harsher steroids are the ones that are most likely to be tapered down in terms of response, and the nicer ones are the ones that you're most likely to run constantly through a cycle. That makes sense in that particular regards, just dealing with side effects. I'm looking here at other options here, Steve. Just on the Masteron, for example, a very, very quick look was two options, Masto P100 and a E200. They've got a Primo, both of which I believe are in Amphate, and one is a 100 milligram and the other one is a 200 milligram. So again, you've got the options through a cycle here, Steve. I've mentioned I'm just looking very quickly. Test suspension is another one. Again, this is a relatively short ester suspension 100. So you get multiple options here. For example, this would be less tapering up and down. We've had products in strength and powerlifting where we use much, much shorter esters for the day of competition in terms of peaking our irritability and our aggression. And also, again, Steve, just for the purposes of being strong as fuck on a particular day. See what I mean again about the day? It's one thing to be a bodybuilder and competing, or someone doing a photo shoot and having a shoot on a certain particular day. But in terms of strength, you want to peak your strength and you want to be as aggressive and as focused as much as possible. We will also, for example, throw in certain particular orals that encourage that aggression, but we do that specifically because they're quicker and quicker out of your system. I'm looking at another one here. See if they got a Boulder on Boldo Test 400. Again, this is something I'd probably run in the middle of a cycle, and that is Boulder on a Declinate 200 and testosterone in Amphate 200. I wouldn't want to vary that too much. I looked at the Winstrol options here, Steve. A Winstrol 10 oral and a Winstrol 50 milligram oral. Very easy to manipulate the numbers there, like I said, with the Dynamo example and the Anavar example that we given earlier. And even they've got here a Winstrol 50 milligrams. What else am I looking at? Very quickly, another trend mix to go with the fat mix that we talked about earlier on. They do, of course, offer products. And again, we would see this. This is another one for side effects, Steve, versus perhaps the end game or results. And this would be their Paratropin 100 IUs. And this thing about being fixed on a certain number and not being able to vary can be thrown out completely when it comes to, for example, your response specifically to growth hormone, which will, I would argue, Steve, although again we are steroid focused in this show, certain products do require you to build up and or taper off. So lots of people have issues with water retention. Lots of people will actually, and this is very dose specific in the terms of carpal tunnel issues, and again, how your body is responding. Some less, and we have seen this recently just in the last day or two, talking about the cost of growth hormone. I've actually argued that it's ridiculously cheap compared to how it used to be. Just as an example again, it is incredibly common in hard training bodybuilders and those people with a decent bit of experience when it comes to using PEDs, so quote unquote, a regular use of steroids, to be looking at 5 IUs, 10 IUs or more, especially in the competing bodybuilders. And yet the great and vast majority of people at 5 IUs per day start to have issues with the side effects. And specifically, it occurs to me, carpal tunnel syndrome. And yet the long-term use of 2 to 2.5 IUs per day, especially, for example, if you're just trying to get lean,
Yeah.
being overweight and you want to get lean, much, much better dosage.
That's
So
a
we
good
don't
point.
have
Yeah.
to stick on certain numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, and with peptides, a lot of people like to pyramid them because growth hormone, for example, if you jump into too much of a dose of growth hormone, like Mobster said, you get carpal tunnel. You can also get water retention, which is the complete opposite of what you're striving for with growth hormone, where it becomes counterproductive. We want to use growth hormone because we want to do anti-aging, we want more energy, we want better sleep. Well, if you're retaining water, none of those things are going to happen. Your sleep is going to get worse retaining water. Just imagine going to sleep with jugs of water all over you. That's the equivalent. Or on during the day, having jugs of water all day, being carried on your back all day, you're going to lose energy. So it works against you. It's going to cause the inflammation in your joints and up and pinching your nerves where you get that carpal
Yeah.
tunnel feeling. So
So
it works against
absolutely,
you.
you could taper off.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's two more, Steve.
Yeah.
These are peptides as well. TB 500 and BPC 157. I can't think of any reason why you would pyramid up or taper off. In the example of these two, there might be something that will occur to me later on, but as we're doing this show, I can't think of any reason. Literally,
I would actually do something similar to taper, but I do front load and taper with TB 500, not
I'm
with
just
BPC.
thinking if your injury that you're taking this product for is starting to heal up, do you taper off because it's getting better, or do you just keep
No,
running
I
the
think
dose
you would with
until
TB
you recover?
500 run a higher dose the first couple
Mm-hmm.
weeks and then taper down. You see what I'm
Mm.
saying? Because this way it gets into your system and
But
then
are
you
you
taper down.
tapering down to an effective dose, or are you tapering down from an effective dose? You
So
see what I
you
mean?
taper it down a little bit to an
Yeah.
effective dose, and then you
Yes,
run
that's
a
right.
maintenance level if you want it,
Yes.
but it's
Until you're recovered.
expensive. So I
Yeah.
mean, but with these peptides, most of these peptides, it doesn't hurt you to run more than you should because the idea with these peptides is they're naturally occurring where you want to get
Yes.
it in your system. So it just depends on your situation, but you definitely don't want to pyramid up these types of healing peptides because it's not going to be as effective as starting up high and then tapering. So it'd be more
Let me touch.
effective
Let me
to do it
touch
that way.
upon the economy thing. When before my Wi-Fi blew up earlier on.
And the nice
So
thing too with Para Pharma, by the way, we're gonna get into Para Pharma in a second. They
yeah.
keep things economical. They keep things
Oh, please.
affordable.
Yes,
You know how much people
absolutely,
are
Steve.
paying to go to anti-aging clinics to get testosterone versus going to Para Pharma and getting testosterone for their
Oh,
TRT?
please, Steve.
Or
Good
how much people
grief.
are paying for these GLP-1s? 1,000 a month, 1,200 a month. They can't even afford them anymore.
More. More.
Yeah,
1,200. Yeah.
but Parapharma is, and in places like Umbrella as well have excellent peptides. So at the end of the day, it's about saving money. That's why we love Parapharma. Parapharma has all these steroids. They're so affordable and they're so available. Mobster just gave you a list of a bunch of options they have on their website, different half lives and
Nothing's
all that other
crazy
stuff.
price now,
So it's
Steve. Look,
wonderful.
let me
So
just touch on it.
finish that
Yeah.
point, and then we'll talk about
Yes.
more Parapharma. Yeah.
So growth hormone is a classic example, and something came up this week, and I won't go to the specifics of the particular member because it's to do with not being able to work and having to go back to his parents and so on and so forth. Asking for some sort of discount code and he wasn't sure if he could mention growth hormone, which of course he can. Absolutely, we're only down on a few things, and those are dangerous. Everything else we're okay with. So anyway, the point made with regards to growth hormone, and again, Parapharma has great growth hormone, the form of paratropin, was the idea of the cost. And the reality of the situation is, and this applies to Parapharma 100%. Steve and I have done shows, and you can literally Google this to see that we're not talking out of our asses, out of our hats. The cost that people used to pay for a month's supply, and back in the day they were getting off AIDS and HIV victims who had spare growth hormone to sell, was typically, and this is not that long ago, Steve, $500 a month. I've seen prices as low as, and this is mostly in sales and sometimes for short dated products, $120 for 100 IUs, and typically 170, maybe 200. And again, you've got the cost of shipping to wherever the fuck you are in the world. And that is for a month's supply. So in real terms, any way that you care to argue, any kind of scale of economy you want to argue, the idea that you were paying 15, 20 years ago, $500, when arguably the dollar was stronger, worth more, and everything else cost less, versus 120, 170, or even $200 per month for a month's supply, plus shipping, just is proof positive with zero argument that you are paying less, and you are paying less in real terms as well as in actual terms. And what you can buy for the dollar then versus what you can buy for the dollar now. There's no argument. Steroids, for the most part, GLPs, peptides, orals, injectables. I don't care how you send them. I've literally just this week seen a UK selling website asking some ridiculous price, equivalent of 130, 140 bucks or more for a 10 mil vial. And I'm like, what the fuck's in that? When I know for a fact with companies that sell Para Pharma products with discounts, with codes, etc., I'm going to pay the equivalent of somewhere between UK pounds, 35 to 40 pounds. So about 50, 55 bucks, 60 bucks. Plus shipping again, and it depends what else you're buying and whether you're doing a deal or not. Right. So again, Look at the prices people used to pay north of the border, Steve, or sorry, south of the border back in the day in Mexico. I go back to my Muscle Media 2000s and I see prices of $120 for a 10 mil vial. That's still fucking £80 UK compared to what I know. I can walk into a gym and pay 30 or £35. I can get it online with a little bit more cost for shipping, etc. But it's still less than 120 bucks. So again, guys, you're paying less. So the argument for the validity, the suggestion of tapering and pyramid just for cost purposes makes no sense. It only made sense to me back in the day, Steve, when I said if I get the same results as if I hadn't pyramid or I hadn't tapered, then surely I'm saving an extra 20 or 30 bucks.
Well, well,
Maybe,
well.
maybe.
In fairness, back in your day, mob, so they didn't have electricity or running water either. So
Yeah, yeah.
that
And no internet. Say, mind you, I didn't have internet 20 years ago. I don't live out in the fucking forest, Steve, under a tree. And I certainly wasn't born under a tree back in the forest or wherever I was. Steve's got me living in a cave or something just 20 years ago.
every time
And
it
luckily we had the
rains where
internet.
Mobster
Oh, the
lives,
wind blows. Yeah, yeah.
we have to literally stop the podcast and wait for his
I,
internet to come back.
as the wind blows hard, Steve,
You would
it
think
makes
these
the fucking
British
lights
people would
flicker
be
on and off.
modern. They think they're modern. They want to go take over the world, and they can't even get their own shit together at home.
Oh, it was okay in the 1800s, Steve, not so much now.
They live in these big castles. So let's talk about Para Pharma a little bit. Nice thing about
Yeah,
Para Pharma, as I
yeah,
said, economically, unbelievable products. They're when you buy from Para Pharma, we just had a guy post. He tested a bunch of products that he ordered himself anonymously. They didn't even know that he would test them. He ordered
yeah,
them, he got them tested. All came in what 97, 98, 99%, which is
yeah.
farmer
All within
grade.
3%, Steve, plus or minus. Yeah,
So fantastic gear. Anything you buy from them, you know is good. They ship fast, great customer service. They are really coming on strong as becoming one of the top brands out there. And a lot of sources out there are reselling their products because there's high demand for it. So Parapharma is a wonderful product. You can come on the forum to find out where to get Parapharma. They're really awesome. So talk about Parapharma for a couple of minutes, Mobster, before we
yeah.
finish.
There's a couple of examples here, Steve. We've had two approved sources products tested this week. Primobolan coming in on point when Primobolan is supposed to be in short supply. We talk about companies like that again. I've just looked at, as I said, the Parapharma website and mentioned Primo during the podcast for the benefit of listeners. Any issues with supply, contact Parapharma yourself. Customer service is on point. There are lab tests on their own site, and there will be independent lab tests like Steve just described. One of the things I recommend regularly is that Steve and I could be arguably accused of being biased by virtue of the sponsors that we have for some of these shows. Not all of our shows are sponsored, but the majority are. And therefore, we could be argued of being biased. So here's what I tell listeners to do. You come onto the forum and you put Para Pharma into the search, and the search comes up with a log or two logs or three logs that are using Para Pharma products. You go and look at those logs and you see this is a person. Let's go to week 1, day 1, the beginning of the log. Slightly overweight, 10, 15 pounds too heavy, wants to get cut, wants to get in shape. Let's go 10 weeks into the log. He's run a Para Pharma cycle for 8 to 12 weeks. He's 10 weeks in, and you click on this 10 weeks in, and you see that he's got abs. He's got veins. His chest has improved in shape. His arms are leaner. There's a noticeable vein running from his shoulder down into his elbow. The guy's got into shape, and you can apply this across the spectrum, whether it's bulking, getting lean, getting muscular, being strong, whatever. Have I run Paraphonics? Absolutely. I've talked about my own response to using their Cut Stack 150 product supplied to me by one of the resellers, and the amazing results in terms of recomposition. I'll just say, as I was 327 pounds. I've talked about this on other shows. I did my free daily steps. I fucking hated it, Steve. It's the first and only time I hated the steps, not the Para Pharma product. First and only time I've used any kind of trend, which was part of the cut stack. And I went from 327 down to 320, lost 2 notches on my belt, which I've managed to maintain for some time now. I'm still in the same size belt. And went back up to 327 with the smaller waist in better condition, which means I recomposition. So not only did I get leaner, not only did I lose size of my waist, but I actually bulked back up. I went straight from that into a bulk with another country's products, got to the biggest I've ever done. And that was off the back of the Para Pharma products. We could talk about the hygiene and sterility, etc., and the post-injection pain that we've touched upon just briefly during the shows when we talked about high dose products. And I said, for example, the idea of me mixing a 500 milligram higher dose product isn't the issue that it used to be. I could absolutely show you guys how it used to be a massive, literal pain in the butt injecting high dose products, whereas all companies, including Para Pharma, have improved their products no end by not sitting on the laws, by listening to what customers want, by using different oils, by playing around with the benzoyl alcohol, etc. ratios, and improving their products so that almost no one gets post-injection pain. Very few that might be especially sensitive, certain esters or certain oils that you're noticing, but it's way, way, way less than it used to be. And this is why Para Pharma works. One last recommendation, just as we finish the show, is literally the idea that sometimes on certain forums, and I'll include ours, Steve, we can again be biased because of support that certain companies give us to that forum. So this is one. Para Pharma is a classic example of this. You go away and you look at a forum that's not associated with who we do these shows for, and you see Para Pharma gets recommendations. You look at the goddamn, and I hate them, Reddit, and Para Pharma is recommended. You go onto social media sites and you see Para Pharma. You do this because then you get a broad spectrum idea that a company is approved, is liked, people are fans of, they have a preference for this product, that this is the reason why they've grown as a brand, because it is industry wide. It's not on one side, another side, it's on multiple sites that have no association with one or the other. Literally, that everybody thinks that Para Pharma is a good product. That's how you build up your brand. That's how you know you're dealing with a solid company. Guys, we've got different ideas. You might have different ideas. You might have specific reasons for pyramid and tapering. What do you think on that? I've talked about the old school approach. Does it still apply? I've talked about the lack of availability versus the availability of products by companies like Para Pharma. What do you think? Does it still work for you? Has there been particular reasons why you've had to do it? Was it an issue with side effects? Was it a lack of availability of esters? Was it literally the source run out of the product that you were looking for? Let us know what you think on the subject. Is there anything that we missed when we were talking about pyramid and tapering that you think we should have included? Let us know in the comments. Let us know. Come onto the forum. Let us know. Check out Para Pharma on the forum. Check out Para Pharma's website. That we think they've got great products. As always, please note we are not doctors, and the opinions we give on these shows are ours. It is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. And podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.